I was poking around in Facebook a couple of weeks ago when I read where our own Jim Sims, Mr. General Evaluator, had been called for jury duty. Jim, how did that work out?
Well, it isn't until October 14th.
Good enough. This is my speech, not yours. Jim hasn't had his day in court yet, but Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, wannabe Toastmasters, I recently had my day in court, and I was not called for jury duty. I had been subpoenaed to testify for the prosecution, and I really didn't want to be there. You see, my dear neighbor, Mrs. Schrader, must have been slightly overserved and perhaps was a little bit tipsy one night, because as she was driving home, she missed her driveway completely, ran through my mailbox, skidded across my lawn sideways, barreled through my back fence, crushing my prized roses, and landed on top of little Fluffy's doghouse. Little Fluffy flew out of her doghouse, yipping and yiping, tail between her legs, and ran through that huge gaping hole in my fence, never to be seen again.
Oh.
But Mrs. Schrader is not only my neighbor, she's my dear, dear friend. And I did not want to testify against her. However, there I found myself sitting in the witness stand in the courthouse in Dade City, a little town that I lived in for many, many years ago. And you might say that I was just a little bit cranky when the pompous, little, portly prosecuting attorney stood up at his table and bellowed across the room, "Mrs. Bowe, do you happen to know who I am?" I looked at him and I looked at him, and though I remember him being a lot thinner and having hair, I did know who he was. "Why, yes, Mr. Foss, I do know you. I've known you since you were just a kid, and frankly, you've been a big disappointment. You're a real loudmouth. In fact, I had heard that you cuss out the staff at that wonderful Limoges restaurant right there on Main Street, and I know you don't tip them. You lie. You manipulate people. You talk about them behind their backs. And you cheat on your wife. You think you're such a big shot, but you're nothing more than a two-bit paper pusher. Yes, Mr. Foss, I do know you." Well, you could see everyone staring at Mr. Foss, and he was completely stunned. First, his face blushed a bright cherry red, and then it blanched to the color of a marshmallow. Not knowing what else to do, he quickly pointed across the room and said, "Mrs. Bowe, do you happen to know the defense attorney, Mr. Gilbertson?" I looked across where he was pointing, and I recognized that long, skinny bag of bones right away. I had seen it just not last week, leaning against the wall of the Neon Cowboy Sports Bar right there in Dade City. Yes, I knew Mr. Gilbertson. And by the way, Mr. Foss, Mr. Gilbertson went to school with my boys. And he was a bad influence on them. Terrible influence on them. Mr. Gilbertson is lazy. He's bigoted. He has a problem maintaining relationships. He has a drinking problem. And his law practice is probably the worst in Dade City, almost as bad as yours. Oh, and by the way, he cheats on his wife with your wife. In the courthouse, you could hear a pin drop. After a long, painful pause, the judge beckoned the attorneys to his bench, and he said, "If either of you two idiots ask that woman if she knows me, I'm going to send you to the electric chair." Case dismissed.